The straw in the 9th kennel smelled of crushed lavender and warm animal, and a Lowen Fairbarrow was on her knees in it, stitching a sprig of dried purple flowers into the seam of a burlap bedding sack, while the largest black wolf she had ever seen watched her with eyes the color of melted gold. She thought he was a stray. She thought he was some battle-scarred rogue who had limped in through the broken fence to steal the patrol hound's supper. She had no idea that the wolf currently drooling on her apron was Alaric Thornmore, Alpha King of the Black Frost territories, the man whose royal bed sat empty in the palace on the hill, its silk sheets turned down by 3 servants every night, and slept in by absolutely no one. I was supposed to be reviewing border reports. I was instead lying in kennel straw, letting a soft-handed Omega girl pick a thorn out of his front paw, and telling himself this was reconnaissance. She tied off her thread and held the sack up to his nose. "There," she said, "lavender. It helps the wounded ones sleep." The old houndmaster says it's nonsense, but the old houndmaster also says wolves can't smell fear, and I have never once met a wolf who couldn't. She tucked the sack under his massive head like a pillow, and the king of 400,000 souls, the wolf who had ended the Iron Veil War with his teeth, laid his skull down on it without a single shred of dignity. I should leave, he thought. I am going to leave. In 1 minute I will get up and leave. That was 6 weeks ago. Lowen Fairbarrow was the straw keeper for the royal kennels, which was the politest possible way of saying she shoveled what the patrol wolves left behind and slept in a lean-to against the kennel's north wall, close enough to hear the hounds breathe. She had come to the capital at 19 when the Ashford pack cast her out, not with drama, not with a trial, just with a closed gate, and her cousin Bram looking at his boots while the latch clicked, because an Omega with no family and a dead mother's debts was a mouth, and mouths were expensive. Nobody had shouted at her. That was the part she still turned over at night like a stone in her pocket. Nobody had even bothered to shout. So she had walked 90 miles to Black Frost with a sewing kit, a tin of her mother's lavender seeds, and a talent for animals that bordered on unnatural. And the palace steward had looked at her thin wrists and given her the job no one wanted. Muck the kennels, bed the straw. Do not speak to nobility. Do not, under any circumstances, go near the wolves when they are fresh from patrol and half-wild. She had lasted 1 day before she broke the last rule. A hound called Turnip had come back from the eastern ridge with a gash along his ribs, snapping at every handler who approached, and Lowen had simply sat down in the muck 3 feet away and started humming and unpicking the hem of her own skirt for bandage cloth, and Turnip had crawled to her on his belly like she was made of firelight. Now she planted lavender in the strip of dirt behind the kennels, dried it in bundles under her lean-to roof, and sewed it into every bedding sack, because wounded creatures slept badly, and badly slept creatures healed slow. And nobody had ever needed to teach her that. The black wolf had appeared on a Thursday at dusk, with a thorn in his paw and a performance of pathetic limping, so committed it deserved a stage. He came back Friday. The thorn was gone. He limped anyway. By the 2nd week, Captain Roshan of the King's Guard stood in the royal bedchamber at dawn, looking at silk sheets that had not been disturbed in 14 days, and said carefully, "Sire, the Chamberlain is asking questions about your bed." "The mattress is lumpy," said the Alpha King, who was at that moment picking straw out of his own hair. "It is goose down, sire, imported, You had it commissioned. Then the geese were lumpy, Roshan. Was there anything else? There was, in fact, quite a lot else. And Roshan knew every bit of it, because Roshan had followed his king's scent trail on the third night out of professional concern, and had stood in the shadows, watching the most feared alpha on the continent roll onto his back in kennel straw, so a girl could scratch his chest. Roshan had served the crown for 20 years. He said nothing, but every morning he set out the king's clothes with a small horsehair brush laid on top for the straw, and every morning the king pretended not to know what the brush was for. The stealing began in week 3. It started with her shawl. Eloan hung her washing on a line behind the lean-to, and one grey morning her good wool shawl, the last thing her mother ever knitted, was simply gone. She searched the mud. She questioned the hounds, who looked guilty about everything, and therefore about nothing. 3 nights later, the black wolf trotted into the kennel yard with the shawl draped over his back like a saddle blanket, filthy, smelling of pine and river water, and dropped it at her feet with the expression of a wolf returning a favor rather than evidence. "You," she said slowly, "are a thief." He sneezed at her. "Don't you sneeze at me. Where did you even take it? It smells like the whole North Forest." She held it up. There was a tear in one corner, and around the tear, pressed into the wool, the faint ring of a careful mouth that had carried it for miles without once biting through. She sat down in the straw and mended the tear while he watched, and if her eyes stung a little, over a shawl, over the fact that something in this world had taken a piece of her and then brought it back, she blamed the lavender dust. In the palace, the Alpha King told himself, it had been a strategic recovery of misplaced textiles. Then came the gifts. A pheasant, whole and enormous, deposited on her doorstep with the pride of a returning general. A river stone, perfectly round. A silver hair comb that was so obviously expensive, so obviously stolen from somewhere with marble floors, that Eloan spent 2 days trying to find its owner before giving up and hiding it in her sewing kit like contraband. The wolf watched her tuck it away and made a low sound deep in his chest that she had begun, worryingly, to recognize as satisfaction. "You can't keep bringing me things," she told him, kneeling to look him in the eye. "Someone is going to think I'm a thief, and they hang thieves who steal from nobles, and then who would sow your lavender, you great black menace?" The wolf considered this. The next night he brought her a duck. The first near catastrophe happened at the Frost Fair in week 5. The whole capital had turned out on the frozen shallows of the river Black Frost, braziers and chestnut smoke, and skate blades hissing, and the Alpha King attended in his human form, because kings must be seen, tall and cold in a black coat with silver stitching, flanked by guards, radiating the particular temperature of a man who would rather be anywhere else. And Eloan, who had been given a rare half-day off, was at a stall buying thread when the crowd shifted and pushed her directly into his path. She dropped her thread. He caught her elbow before she fell. For one terrible second, they were close enough that she could smell him, cedar and cold iron, and something underneath, something warm and animal and known. And her whole body went still with the confusion of a person hearing a stranger hum her mother's lullaby. "Forgive me, sire," she whispered, eyes down, because Omegas of no rank did not look at kings. "Watch your step," said the Alpha King, in a voice like a door closing, and released her elbow as if it had burned him, and walked on. Inside his own skull, the wolf was howling. That was her. That was her. She smells like lavender and wood smoke and home, "Turn around, you absolute coward! Turn around!" The man kept walking. The man's hands, jammed in his pockets, were shaking. That night, the wolf arrived at the kennels early and pressed his enormous head against her stomach and stayed that way for a long time. And Elowen, who'd had a strange Saul's-inked day for reasons she couldn't name, wrapped her arms around his neck and said, "I met the king today. He caught me when I fell." The wolf went very still. "Everyone says he's made of ice, but his hands were warm. Isn't that odd?" She scratched behind his ear. "You'd hate him. He looks like the sort of man who's never once slept in straw." The wolf made a sound that was almost a cough. The escalation reached its final form in week 6, on the night of the first true snow, when Elowen woke at midnight to a lean-to noticeably shrunken in size and 180 pounds of wolf occupying 2/3 of her cot. He had opened the door. He had opened the latched door, which should have been impossible, and she was too cold and too tired to interrogate a miracle. So she simply muttered, "You take the wall side at least," and rolled over and slept better than she had in 9 years, with her back against a furnace of black fur and a slow heartbeat like a drum underground. In the palace, the chamberlain quietly stopped turning down the royal bed. "Sire," Roshan said the next morning, with the expression of a man walking across a frozen lake, "the kennel girl, Elowen Fair Barrow. Should I perhaps arrange for her lean-to be repaired? There is a gap in the roof, purely for the health of the kennels, of course." "I don't know who you're talking about," said the Alpha King, signing a trade decree. "Of course, sire. The northeast corner. The gap is in the northeast corner. Send the good Thatcher, not the one who drinks." "At once, sire." And then there was the bath, and the bath was where it all began to slide toward the cliff. The wolf came back from wherever wolves go, with half a bog attached to him, reeking, matted, deeply pleased with himself, and Elowen took one look and dragged the tin washtub out into the yard and heated water over the fire and ordered him in, and the Alpha King of the Black Frost territories, who had drowned a usurper in the Iron Vale Delta with his bare hands, climbed meekly into a tub 3 sizes too small and sat there like an enormous, miserable duckling, while a girl in a patched apron scrubbed lavender soap into his ruff and scolded him about bogs. Her fingers worked through his fur, down his neck, along the old ridged scar on his left shoulder, where an Iron Vale spear had gone in 11 years ago, and she paused there, frowning, gentle. "Who did this to you?" she asked quietly. This was no animal. This was a blade. She pressed her palm flat over the scar, and the wolf shut his eyes. "Whoever they were, I hope you bit them." "I did," he thought. "I bit him quite a lot." She rinsed him with warm water, toweled him with sacking, and he shook himself and soaked her head to foot anyway. And she shrieked and laughed, actually laughed, bright and unguarded in the cold yard, with steam rising off them both, and something in the king's chest turned over with a sound like a lock opening, and the wolf inside him said, with terrible calm, "She is our mate. You know she is our mate. You have known since the thorn." "Shut up," said the man. "You cannot court her as a wolf forever." "Watch me," said the man, who was a king and a war hero and an idiot. The trouble arrived in a gilded carriage, the way trouble often does. Her name was Lady Maran of Silverpine, and she came south through the mountain pass with 40 retainers and a marriage proposal ratified by half the royal council, because Silverpine held the northern passes, and the northern passes held back the rogue clans, and Councillor Vesic, who had spent 30 years arranging the kingdom like furniture, had decided it was time his king produced an heir with strategic value. Lady Maren was beautiful in the way of a sword hung on a wall. She did not smile when she was presented at court. She assessed the throne room the way a quartermaster assesses a granary, and when she was introduced to the Alpha King, she looked him precisely in the eye, which almost no one dared, and said, "I'm told you refuse your own bed, sire. I hope the crown's furniture will not be a point of contention between us." Roshan developed a sudden cough. "There is no us, Lady Maren," said the king. "There is a treaty under negotiation." "Of course," she said. "I negotiate well." That night, the wolf did not go to the kennels, because the council session ran until the small hours, Vesic laying out grain figures and rogue raid reports like a man dealing cards. He had already counted, and when the king finally walked the cold corridors to his chamber, he stood a long moment looking at the royal bed, huge and silk and hateful, and then lay down on the floor in front of the fire with his coat for a pillow. Even that was better than the bed. The bed smelled of nothing. The straw smelled of her. Eloan waited in the kennel yard until the stars wheeled past midnight, a bowl of scraps going cold at her feet, and told herself it was foolish to worry about a wild animal, and worried anyway. And when he finally came the following evening, she ran to and buried her face in his neck and said, "Don't do that. Don't just not come. I thought you were in a snare somewhere." And the king felt each word land in him like an arrow, because no one, in the whole span of his reign, had ever once wondered where he was at night. They wondered where the king was. That was different. That was a question about furniture. It was that night, with snow ticking against the lean-to roof, and the wolf stretched along her cot with his head on her lap, that she told him the thing she had never told anyone. "I'm going to tell you a secret," she said, working a burr out of his ear fur, "because you can't repeat it, and because if I don't say it out loud to somebody, I think it'll go rotten in me." Her fingers stilled. "When Ashford put me out, I stood at the gate for an hour, in the rain, because I was so sure, that somebody would come. Bram, maybe. Or old Mother Tansy, who I sat with every fever she ever had. Somebody would come to the gate and say, 'Wait, not her. We want her.' The fire popped. The wolf did not move, did not breathe. Nobody came. And the worst part isn't that they didn't love me. You can't make but people love you, that's nobody's crime. The worst part is I stood there an hour in the rain, believing they did. That's what I can't forgive. Not them. Me. For believing it." She laughed, small and crooked, and wiped her face with the heel of her hand. "So now I love things that can't lie to me. Hounds, lavender, you." She bent and pressed her forehead between his ears. "You're the only one who's never lied to me." The wolf lay in the dark with his mate's tears in his fur, and understood, with perfect and horrible clarity, exactly what he had built, and exactly how it would burn. "Tell her," said the wolf inside the man inside the wolf. "Tomorrow," said the man. "I'll tell her tomorrow." He did not tell her tomorrow. Tomorrow, the hounds began to die. It was Turnip first, the big, soft-mouthed tracker, found rigid and foaming in his kennel at dawn, and then 2 more by noon, and the houndmaster wailing, and the steward shouting, and Councillor Vesic arriving with unusual speed for a man of his age, trailed by guards, to stand over the bodies and say, in a voice pitched to carry, "Wolfsbane! Someone has been putting wolfsbane in the bedding," and then, turning, mild as milk, Who sews the bedding sacks? They found dried aconite in Eloan's lean-to, tucked inside her sewing kit, right beside a silver hair comb bearing the crest of silver pine. And the story assembled itself in front of the whole kennel yard with the smooth click of something manufactured. The strange Omega girl, cast out of her old pack, no family, no character witnesses, caught with poison and stolen noble property, softening up the royal kennels for the rogue clans everyone knew were massing in the passes. Eloan stood in the mud with her hands bound and heard her own voice from very far away, saying, "That isn't mine. I dry lavender. I would never. I raised turnip from a pup," and saw in the faces around her the same expression she had seen at the Ashford gate. Not hatred, just doors closing. "Take her to the lower cells," said Vesic. Only one person spoke. Lady Maren, who had come down to see the kennels and stood at the edge of the crowd, looked for a long moment at Eloan's sewing kit, at the comb, at the too neat bundle of aconite, and said, "Counsellor, my comb went missing from my chambers on the second night, before this girl could possibly have entered the palace wing." Vesic looked at her. Something passed between them, old and cold. Maren held his gaze a heartbeat longer, then dropped her eyes and said no more. And Eloan never forgot that, later. That the sword on the wall had for one moment tried. The king was on the eastern ridge with a patrol when Roshan's messenger reached him, and afterward the patrol wolves would tell the story in hushed voices for years, how the Alpha King read 4 lines of dispatch, went white, and shifted so fast his coat tore, and was gone north through the snow like something thrown from a bow. I was too late to stop the trial. He was not too late for what Vesic had planned instead of won. Because Vesic, whatever his sins, was no fool, and a trial meant testimony, and testimony was a loose thread, and Vesic had spent 30 years snipping loose threads for the good of a kingdom. He genuinely, in the coldest chamber of his heart, believed he was saving. He had watched his king hollow out over 6 inexplicable weeks, sleeping nowhere, signing nothing, missing counsels, and he had traced the rot to a kennel girl, and he had done what one did with rot. So that night, the cell door of the lower cells was left unlocked, and 2 men who were not palace guards came down the stone stairs with knives, because a poisoner slain trying to escape required no trial at all. Eloan heard their boots. She pressed her back to the cell wall and thought absurdly of lavender, of how you had to cut it before full bloom or the oil went bitter. And then the first man came through the door, and then the wall behind him came apart. Not the door, the wall. 4 feet of stone, and through it, roaring, came the black wolf. Her black wolf, dust and torchlight and gold eyes gone incandescent, and he took the first knife man out of the doorway, like a storm taking a fence post. The second man got his blade up. It didn't matter. What happened next took 4 seconds, and Eloan would never fully remember it, only the sound, and then the silence, and then her wolf turning to her in the settling dust, bleeding from a slash along his ribs. And she was already moving to him, hands out, healer's hands, saying, "You're hurt, hold still, you great menace, let me see." And the wolf looked at her, and there was a decision in his eyes. Then the wolf stood up, for receded like a tide going out. Black hair, broad shoulders, the torn ruin of a king's coat still caught on one arm, a knife slash along human ribs, and the old ridged spear scar on the left shoulder, exactly where her palm had rested in the bath, and the Alpha King of the Black Frost territories stood before her in the torchlight of a broken cell, chest heaving, and said her name. Eloan. She did not scream. She did not faint. She stood very still and looked at the scar, and then at his eyes, melted gold, and said in a voice like a snapped thread, "I know." He stared at her. "The frost fair," she said. "Your hands were warm, and you smelled like my cot. I told myself I was mad." Then the bath, that scar, an iron veil blade, and every ballad in the kingdom sings about where the spear took the king. I told myself I was mad again. I have been telling myself I was mad for 3 weeks, because the other possibility, sire, and the word came out like a slap. The other possibility was that I told the King of Black Frost about the Ashford Gate, that I cried into the king's fur, that I have been sleeping, next to the man who owns the ground my lean-to sits on, and he let me. You let me say you were the only one who never lied to me. You lay there with your head in my lap, and you let me say it. Eloan. Was it funny? Her voice cracked down the middle. The duck? The shawl? Was I funny? You were the only real thing in my life, said the king. The words landed in the stone silence, and he took one step toward her, and stopped, because a king does not get to close that distance. Only a wolf did, and the wolf had been a lie of shape, if never of heart. So he stood where he was bleeding, and confessed the whole ledger like a man emptying his pockets before a judge. The thorn was real. Everything after was a choice. The limp was a performance. I practiced it. God help me. I took the because you were away 2 days at the market, and I couldn't. I could not be near your scent, and I couldn't stay away. And I carried it to the North Forest, and slept on it like a green pup, and tore it, and hated myself, and brought it back. The comb was from my own mother's estate, not stolen, mine to give, the only courting gift I could think of, that a wolf could carry. I unlatched your door in the snow because you were shivering. I could hear you shivering through the wall. The thatcher, the good one, that was me. I have not slept in my own bed in 6 weeks because it doesn't smell of lavender, and my guard captain has been brushing straw off my coat every morning and pretending it's dignity. He ran out of breath. And every single day I told myself, tomorrow. Tomorrow I tell her. And then you said the thing about the gate, about believing, and I understood that the truth would put you right back in the rain, and I was a coward. That's all of it. That's everything. He looked at her bound hands, still bound, and his voice dropped to gravel. You are my mate, Eloan Fairbarrow. The wolf knew it in the first hour. The man has known it since the bath. You owe that fact nothing. You may hate me from now until the mountains wear down, and I will still tear this kingdom to its foundations before anyone touches you again. Those 2 things are not a bargain. They are both simply true. Eloan looked at him for a long time. Somewhere above them, boots were thundering downstairs. Roshan's voice shouting for the king. Untie my hands, she said. He crossed to her and did it, careful, his big hands unsteady on the knots. And when the rope fell away, she flexed her fingers, and then she hit him, once, open-palmed, on the uninjured side of his chest. Not gently. That's for the lavender soap, she said. I used my whole month's ration on the King of Black Frost. Her eyes were streaming. And this is for the door latch. She took his face in both hands. This cold, feared, impossible man drew him down and pressed her forehead to his, the way she had 100 times when he wore fur, and felt him shudder like a struck bell. "I'm still angry," she whispered. "I'm going to be angry for a while. Don't you dare mistake this for finished." "Understood," said the Alpha King, in the voice of a man being handed back his life. "May I do one thing while you're still angry?" "What?" "Justice," he said, and his eyes went to gold. They brought her up from the cells not as a prisoner, but at the king's right hand, through corridors of gaping servants, into the great hall where the council had been dragged from their beds, Vesic in the center of them, in a hastily belted robe, already talking, already smoothing. "Sire, whatever you have been told." And the king crossed the hall in a silence like deep snow, and set on the council table 3 things: a bundle of dried aconite, a dead man's knife from the lower cells, and the requisition ledger from Vesic's own office, which Roshan had spent a very productive hour with, showing the purchase of aconite root under a false seal 9 days before Lady Maren's carriage ever crossed the pass. "You poisoned my hounds," said the king quietly, which was worse than shouting. "You framed an innocent Omega, and when even a false trial seemed too risky, you sent knives into my house. And here is the strange thing, the thing the ballads later got wrong. Vesic did not sneer, and did not grovel. He stood looking at the ledger, an old man in a bathrobe, and for a moment his face was simply tired, and he said, 'Your father missed 4 councils in his whole reign, and I buried him, and I held this kingdom together through the regency with string and lies while you learned to fight. I have given it everything I had, every hour. I never married, and I watched you throw it into a kennel, and I did what I have always done, sire. I cut the rot out. I was wrong about which part was rot.' He looked briefly at Aloan, and something moved behind his eyes that might have been the ruin of an apology. 'The hounds,' he said. 'I did regret the hounds.' 'The northern fort at Cold Mere needs a quartermaster,' said the king. 'It is a life sentence with paperwork. You will take it, and you will be good at it, because you are incapable of being anything else. Get out of my hall.' Lady Maren got her grain treaty. She negotiated it in a single afternoon, mercilessly, got better terms than Vesic had ever offered her. And on the palace steps, drawing on her travelling gloves, she paused beside Aloan and said, 'The comb suits you better than it would have suited me. I only ever wanted the granaries.' A beat. 'He looked at you across a courtyard the way men look at fires in winter. No one has ever looked at me that way, and I find I mind less than I expected. Feed him properly. He forgets.' And she swept down the steps to her carriage and was gone north, and Elowen decided she liked her enormously. The claiming, when it came, was not in a hall. The king had the entire pack assembled at the next full moon in the great courtyard, every noble, every guard, every kennel hand and scullery maid. And Aloan stood beside him in a plain green dress she had refused to let the palace tailors improve, and the whole assembly waited for a coronation speech, a decree, a scroll. Instead, the Alpha King of the Black Frost territories took her hand, lifted it, and said 7 words to 400 people. 'She is mine, I am hers, witness,' and then before the whole pack, before the nobility of 6 territories, the king shifted, black fur pouring over him like night falling, and the great wolf walked to Aloan Fairbarrow and lay down at her feet and rolled deliberately, shamelessly, belly to the moon in front of everyone, and the courtyard learned in one collective held breath exactly who ruled whom. Eloan looked down at him. The pack watched their new Luna, the kennel girl, the poisoner that wasn't, to see what she would do with all that power lying in the dust before her. She crouched and scratched his chest and said, clearly enough to carry, "You great black menace. You're getting bathed before you touch any bed of mine." The pack's roar of laughter shook snow off the courtyard eaves, and the bond, when it settled over them both in the moonlight, smelled of cedar and lavender, and felt like a door opening. They tore out the goose-down mattress that same month. Eloan had a pallet made instead, canvas over fresh straw, changed weekly, and she sat cross-legged on the royal bed frame on the first night of spring, with her old sewing kit open beside her, stitching dried lavender into the seams while her husband, king, mate, Menace, lay across the foot of the bed in fur, because he claimed his human back ached from treaty signings, which was a lie, and they both knew it, and neither said so. Through the open window came the smell of the kennel gardens, the new lavender beds she'd tripled in size, and the distant, contented grumbling of hounds. She tied off her thread. She held the finished sack to his nose, the way she had that first Thursday in the 9th kennel, when he was a stray, and she was nobody. "There," she said, "it helps the wounded ones sleep." The great black wolf laid his head in her lap, and one gold eye slid shut, and then the other, and the needle went back into the cloth, and the only sounds in the royal bedchamber of the Black Frost territories were a heartbeat like a drum underground, and thread pulling through burlap, and outside the window, wind moving through rows and rows of lavender.